today we are really happy to just really dive into the subject of intercultural movemental planting, church planting. Churches continue to be one of the most segregated institutions along the lines of race and class. And we are asking the question, how might a missional movement of beloved communities be an alternative and conspire for change in our local neighborhoods? This is a national discussion, and there's a lot of talk about starting multi-ethnic faith communities, but we've got to ask some challenging questions, and some of those are: is this effort perpetuating the dominant forms of power? Is it genuinely intercultural? We have the opportunity to draw from the wisdom of intercultural mission movements led by people of color and poor people in the US as well as the global South. And this webinar is intended to be a resource, full conversation on what it's like to start a new church that attends to the economic and racial disparities, as we think about the idea of building a network of beloved communities that walk humbly, love mercy, and do justice as a witness to the gospel. And so today we will discuss, what does it mean to be involved in intercultural church planting? What are the possibilities of the beloved community? We're going to discuss different theories of change in the multi-ethnic conversation. We'll explore the different movements of origin in the Black church and discern strategies for social enterprises, community development, nonviolent direct action, as well as intercultural liturgy and contemplative practices. To guide us today, we are blessed to have Brandon Rencher, who is a public speaker, a writer, a group facilitator. He's a trainer working within faith, education, and nonprofit sectors at the intersections of decolonized faith, contemplative activism, and local presence to build beloved communities. He is the planter and the architect of the Good Neighbor movement in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina. He's rooted his formation in small towns and the Black church. Brandon's visionary leadership has spanned rural and urban communities in North Carolina and Chicago. He's active in several national networks, including the CCDA, Rural Advancement Foundation International, the V3 Church Planting Movement, and the Faith Rooted Organizing Unnetwork. He's married to Erica, a public educator, and he's also a father of 2 boys. And of course, we have with us today also Dan White Jr., who co-planted Axiom Church in Syracuse, New York. He is a strategist with the V3 movement. He's a coach with the coaching cohorts around the country. He's written 3 books: Subterranean, The Church's Movement, co-authored with J.R. Woodward, Love Over Fear, his most recent book, and he co-founded the Praxis Gathering in Philadelphia. I'm excited to join you as Lori Ruffin. I am the founder of the COO team, as well as the operations manager of the V3 movement. And so we're glad to be in this conversation today. With that, I will pass the mic over to Brandon, who will lead us and guide us into this conversation. Dan will ask some questions, and then we will hear from you, whatever questions you have, the different things that kind of stick out to you. We'd love to hear at the end of our call. So as they come to your mind, again, we want to invite you to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A section, and we will address as many of them as we can. And so without further ado, I give you Brandon Rencher.
Hey, thanks, Lori. Hey, everyone. What's up, Dan? V3 Tribe. I'm just going to share just for about 10 minutes or so to give a little bit of context around intercultural movemental planting, what we're calling that. And let me begin by saying a little bit more about how I come into this work of this particular way of doing church planting. I have a background in starting lots of different kinds of ministries and church planting and in rural, like as mentioned, rural and urban contexts. And really got the itch for church planting and kind of innovative spiritual doing spiritual innovation from my mom, and she just modeled for me early on in my life here in North Carolina, small town North Carolina, the importance of embodying an apostolic leadership to reach people that were outside of the four walls of our conventional churches, and to meet needs and to do life with people. And so that was really formative for me early on in my life, and to be able to journey with her in doing that. And that has just continued for me throughout college, and in my early years of working in sales, and then on into seminary and beyond. Most recently, I have had the great privilege and pleasure of planting with neighbors and friends the Good Neighbor Movement here in Greensboro, North Carolina. And the Good Neighbor Movement is a network of intercultural missional communities rooted in spirituality and social justice. And been such a pleasure to be involved in this work in this season of my life. And I'm really passionate about intercultural movemental planting. And so I want to do a little bit of kind of definition work. I think that's important just to get some clarity there. Um, so what is intercultural movemental planting? Perhaps a straightforward definition would be missional communities that are diverse racially and socioeconomically, that are people of color and Black led, that are place based, and that are justice oriented. So that's a pretty straightforward way to define intercultural movemental planting. Um, because of the relation, in particular with the relationship with V3, and V3's signature of multiplying missional incarnational communities, there's really a home within the V3 tribe for doing movemental planting, and the intercultural piece really comes along really neatly in that way. Another way to unpack the definition is to break it down word by word if you are more literal in looking at things. And so the word intercultural, the word inter means shared or between. That prefix, it means among. Another definition of inter as a prefix is reciprocal, which I actually like a whole lot. It probably that I like that term probably better than the others. And then culture, which can describe a person's race, their class, their geography. It can describe many different aspects of a person's social, what we often call social location. And so intercultural would mean reciprocal in the context of different cultures. So yeah, that there are relationships that are between diverse people, right? And we may get into this a little bit more later, but what distinguishes the word intercultural from, say, multicultural, for example, or multi-ethnic, which is that kind of used interchangeably, is that you can have the presence of people from many different backgrounds, from diverse backgrounds that aren't necessarily in relationship, um, and that aren't necessarily, and even taking a step beyond relationship, that aren't reciprocating whatever the goal is, or the shared goals are with that body of people. And so another way to break down intercultural is to also talk about how, if this is reciprocal, that means that no one is left unchanged. Oftentimes in the multi-ethnic, multicultural conversation, there is still a dominant culture, and typically that is a white American culture. So within intercultural context, intercultural ministry, intercultural planting, no one is left unchanged. The idea is to for everyone to be addressing the injustices that cause the need, the divisions that exist in the first place, and the need for bringing people together. And so no one is left unchanged. So that kind of unpacks intercultural. Movemental. There's a lot of literature out about movemental right now. There's a real urgency to be movemental in how we do church. V3 is a leader in that conversation, and so I won't say too much about that, except that movemental means to be leaderful. Leaderful. It means to be dynamic. It means to be reaching a multitude of people and places. In other words, maybe another one word that would describe movemental would be that it's decentralized in a sense, that it's seeking to take the word, the ministry, the gospel, and put it into the hands of the people, and not just in the hands of one person or a paid staff or one particular team. Um, and then the importance of place is really critical too. It's not just about people; it's about places. To be able to move throughout different places within a particular geographic location, a city, etc. And then planting, that this is a new work, that you're doing a new thing. And so you put all that together. Intercultural movemental planting is about um, yeah, these networks of missional communities that are bringing diverse people together across many different sort of social locations to engage in the work of justice and to engage in work that is place based and spreading the ministry and the gospel and this good news and this vision of what Lori referred to and that Martin Luther King sort of popularized, this notion of the beloved community, spreading that in all places. Um, so that's intercultural movemental planting. And then I want to say a little bit about why I think this model is significant at this time. I think there are some common rationales or reasons why this model is relevant, and I share them, and they've honestly been really critical to my formation and sense of call throughout the years that I've been involved in this kind of ministry. So I want to share those first. Um, and really, it comes from the New Testament teaching and call to the ministry of reconciliation that we see in Colossians, in Second Corinthians, and elsewhere in the New Testament. Also, the vision of new creation in Revelation. If you're familiar with that, it talks about that the new creations, the new heavens and the new earth would be comprised of people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. And then lastly, I think there's often a rationale for this model of planting, intercultural movemental planting, because of the demographic shifts, in particular in the U.S. But the truth is, even though we highlight the demographic shifts in the U.S., and I'll just say what those are. But a lot of the statistics say that by 2045, that there will be no racial majority in the U.S. And that has been a significant impetus for folks taking seriously the need to do intercultural movemental planting, um, and multi-ethnic planting also. But it's also true of the wide outside of the U.S., outside of these borders, that the world is becoming more globalized, and so there really is a need to be equipped to engage people that are very different from us, because who we identify as neighbor is no longer a person that looks just like us or has the exact same socioeconomic background or even the same religious background. So this is a really, really important time to be engaged in intercultural movemental planting. And so I share all those. Those are very relevant for my sense of call to be involved in this kind of church planting. But more recently, in 2016, I think things shifted even more for me in terms of the urgency of this particular model of planting. And what happened was I really felt a moral and prophetic urgency to be involved in this kind of planting, and not just for myself, but to champion it amongst others. And really that moral and prophetic call, that moral and prophetic urgency was around joining a revival of a grassroots Jesus movement that would be led by the poor, that would be led by people of color and Black people, that would be multiracial, and that would be engaged in the work of healing and justice in neighborhoods across the United States. And that kind of revival would be not kind of siloed, or wouldn't be coming out of nowhere, but that it would be born out of a long tradition of radical grassroots Christianity. And just to name a few of those traditions, traditions like the Catholic worker tradition, traditions like the Southern Freedom Movement, that's more popularly or called in the secular context the Civil Rights Movement. Traditions like the abolitionist movement, the base ecclesial movement of the global South, and even the period of Reconstruction and the populist movement that was within that context. These are just a few of the movements that were rooted in faith, in Christian faith, in a particular living out of the gospel that was deeply missional, that was intercultural, and that was seeking to do the work of healing and justice. But what is often unsung because of the dominant Christianity that has been in this land from the beginning, that frankly has always been well adjusted to the evils of slavery in one form or another from the foundation of this country's from the founding of this country. And so yeah, there is this, for me, there is this prophetic and moral urgency and call for the significance of intercultural movemental planting at this time in the U.S. and really globally. Um, and so, lastly, I'll say that intercultural movemental planting isn't sort of the end all be all. It is one stream. It is one iteration, one pathway of seeking to embody and to live out this revival. And there are many companion models and streams that are seeking to do similar kind of work. But there really is an urgency for doing intercultural movemental planting at this present time. So I'll stop there because I've been talking for a little while, and I love for Dan to jump in.
Brandon, I'm already stirred up just hearing your intro, bro. I want to try to get at maybe some nuances that like are maybe between the bricks a little bit. And the you talked about these reciprocal relationships, and that a truly intercultural expression, there's a kind of a mutual shared life. There's a transformation that's happening specifically amongst people. But then you contrasted it just really quickly around you can assemble a diverse crowd without reciprocal relationships.
Right.
And so I want to get at that a little bit. How can multi-ethnic conversation or multi-ethnic approach to being the church actually perpetuate dominant forms of power versus a more movemental intercultural approach not do that? I'm trying to get at like what's the difference there, what you see there. Is that question too cloudy? You understand what I'm asking?
I would say here's some specific examples just to fire them off and keep going. I think probably the more familiar example would be what you see in leadership. So like leadership of a church plant or church that's proclaiming to be multi-ethnic is in particular all white, right? That's what we tend to see. That tends to be the sort of dominant form. And there's no sense of not only representation, but a real strong sense of relationship and engagement into those communities, those ethnic minority communities that exist within that congregation. So that's one example. Another issue would be when you have take for example a multi-ethnic church's sense of mission, like local mission, may unintentionally perpetuate the kinds of unhealthy power dynamics that may look more like what is now being called toxic charity, right? Rather than the kind of work of being present in a neighborhood that is comprised primarily of ethnic minorities, for example, because say that churches, typically the way we do local missions is that we do it in contexts that are underserved or that are poor, and disproportionately poverty falls along racial lines in this country. And so those would be a couple of the examples of how the dominant forms of power, dominant forms or unhealthy forms of power show up inside of multi-ethnic context. Even when folks are very well intentioned, folks are not necessarily intending to be that way. But there is not the kind of vigilance and perhaps the kind of equipping that is necessary to help shed light on that. And often I've even seen where when light is shed on it, because that power has become entrenched, there is an unwillingness to release it and to share it and to empower folks who, that come from ethnic minority backgrounds, for example, or that come from poor backgrounds, to stand up and lead and to take stands around the kinds of ministries and opportunities that matter to not just sort of a sort of token individual within that community, but to the wider community itself in a more holistic and collective way.
Brandon, do you see how, or do you think that our ecclesiology, the actual way we gather, can impact the perpetuating of kind of a white power dynamic versus a more leaderful environment where those who are poor and those who are people of color can actually contribute to the movement? Does our ecclesiology have anything to do with kind of ensconcing that power?
I'll answer that and say that it can.
Okay.
So it doesn't have to be that way. So I've seen,
Hmm.
for example, multi-ethnic churches um, that or sort of black churches or brown churches that are deeply inclusive of changing
Mm.
neighborhoods that include sort of that white folks are moving into the neighborhood kind of thing.
Yep. Yep.
I've seen where it's a more conventional structure,
Hmm.
where and let's just say that conventional structure is a Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, or multiple
Sure.
services,
Yep.
a band, a
Yep.
preacher, like what you may typically
Gotcha.
experience
Yep.
when you engage church. I've seen those kinds of contexts be much more intercultural, um,
Mm.
and provide opportunities. But I think the intentionality is everything, right?
Right.
It's intentionality of the kind of culture that's set up in the congregation, and the kind of leadership that is put in place. And I've even seen how congregations have been able to sort of turn the ship to be more intercultural. So I don't want to just,
Yep.
I don't think it's limited to form is what I'm trying to get at. I think there
Yep.
can be a variety of forms, but I think the function, right, of
Right.
commitment to doing intercultural ministry,
That's
commitment
good.
to the work of justice can exist across forms. Um, I do think some forms are more um, create more barriers though, right? So I don't want to
Hmm.
just say that all forms are created equal kind of thing. I think
Right.
that there are some forms of doing church, like missional community, for example,
Hmm.
that allow for a more leaderful environment.
Right.
Um, that it's not that leadership doesn't just exist on a Sunday morning, for example,
Right.
or in the building of the church. That
Right.
leadership can exist inside of our homes, can exist in our neighborhood associations. That leadership
Mm.
can exist in our advocacy groups, and that's all tied to the work of missional community. And that
That's really good.
provides multiple opportunities for folks from a variety of backgrounds to step up into leadership. And frankly, oftentimes having that kind of a model of leadership can be the kind of can provide the kind of exhale for folks that maybe are afraid and have fear around releasing and letting go of power.
Mm.
Because oftentimes it comes from a mentality of scarcity, that if I let other people lead, and if I let too many people lead, how am I going to be able to control this thing that I've made,
Ah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I don't want
Yeah.
to. I think that missional communities provide a unique opportunity to provide a multitude of leadership, both people who are members of missional communities and folks that say we might call people of peace that
Yes.
exist in the neighborhood, or partners that exist in the neighborhood with the missional community, that they are also an extension of that ministry, and can be leaders as well. So
That's good, man.
yeah.
Brandon, the second question I have is, well, I'm a white guy,
Hmm.
right?
No,
That's not a
no
surprise to
kidding,
you.
Dan.
And you've used you've said a few times black led,
Yeah.
and so I'm curious how how does a white guy, even white woman, participate, contribute? Uh, can they contribute in intercultural intercultural church planting? Probably
Yeah.
this is a personal question. I'm asking about my presence and how that would
Yeah.
contribute or not.
Part of the wisdom of against these movements, these grassroots intercultural people of color and poor people led movements throughout well, let's just limit it to the US's history, is that this has been done before, where
Mm,
white folks are absolutely involved in that work. Um, but and this again structure plays a huge role in this. Like, do we have a team oriented um, sort of structure, or do we
right.
have a kind of hierarchical kind of structure, or
Okay.
a kind of savior kind of CEO kind of model structure? I think a
Mm,
lot of that plays into it, and that when you have a team structure, there is more possibility and opportunity for white folks and a variety of folks to be involved in leadership, which I
right.
think is really really critical. I've also seen it in a more conventional setting where there's a co leader kind of model, so a co-pastor kind of model, where you might have a white pastor and a black pastor, or a white pastor and an Asian, right? I do think that the commitment that one has to make around intercultural movemental planting is a commitment to not tolerate white supremacy, right?
Mm,
Because it's a principality and power that will kill the very
yes.
souls of our people and our neighbor, and it has been killing us. And
Yeah.
so it's been killing white people too, right? And
Yes.
so
Yes.
part of the invitation in for white folks is to play a role of following the leadership of people of
Hmm.
color, of coming alongside of, right?
Yes.
Not necessarily the presumption that if there is a senior or a primary kind of leadership role, that a white person has to play that role.
Right.
Um, and the other thing, the last thing I'll say that's different than white supremacy and different that's not related that's related to the question of white supremacy and structures is the issue of culture. We're always setting up cultures in our
Yes.
congregational life and in our neighborhoods. And so how do we there is such a thing as white culture, right? That's not necessarily evil or bad, right? But is tends to be the kind of practices and rituals and
Mm.
lifestyles that white folks tend to embody. And the question then becomes for white folks, right? But the truth is really any demographic. How are we decentering, right?
Yeah.
Sort of a dominant kind of cultural
Mm.
paradigm, which is different again than the question of who gets to make decisions and who has power to name the direction of the ministry. Culture, I don't want to put too tight of a line there. They do overlap,
Yep.
but I do think that that the question of culture is important to raise as well. So
Mm. So this isn't just a webinar on intercultural church. It's
yeah.
intercultural church planning. And
Mhm.
I'll be honest with you, Brandon, I hear a lot of church planning language from white folks, but not a lot from people of color.
Mhm.
That might be because my world is
Mhm.
narrow.
Yeah.
Do you see that? And if so, why church planning is really really important, or why
Mhm.
it hasn't actually been championed coming out of that space of people of color?
So I would say it's a language issue. So
Okay.
it has been championed. I mean,
Yep.
part of my story is that it's been championed.
Yes.
My mom, would be someone that I would call a church planter, right?
Mm.
Like, but she would have never used that designation. Um,
Mm.
the the industry of church planting has been a white industry, right? A white
Right.
evangelical industry that is
Yep.
tied to funding and that is
Yep.
tied to particular institutions that,
Yes.
frankly, for many many years were segregated institutions. They
Hmm.
were not institutions that people of color and black people were allowed to participate in. They
Hmm.
required certain kinds of training that black and brown people were not allowed to participate in. And
Gotcha.
so the industry of church planting is overwhelmingly a white industry because of racism, not
Mm.
because people of color and black people have not been participating in the work of church planting. One way to
Right
think
on.
about this is that any black church that you see in a neighborhood came to exist because of a movement of church planting. You know,
Right.
you take Richard
Right.
Allen, for example, probably the most prominent example would be, the early debates in our mainline denominations around the question of race and slavery. And what happened
Hmm.
was you have folks like Richard Allen, for example, in the AME church, who engaged in civil disobedience, right? Again, these movemental origins where he said, I'm entitled to this ecclesial structure as much as anyone else. If I'm not going to
Mm.
be a part of it, you got to kick me out.
Mm.
I'm not just going to leave, right? And
Hmm.
and that's what happened, right? And so
Yep.
and what did they do? They started planting. It led to this movemental work of the AME church that still exists to this day.
Right.
Um, so church planting has been a part of the DNA
Yep.
of Black ecclesial life. More recent, say kind of definitely post slavery, but then like kind of 20th century Black
Hmm.
church life. People would use the work of, people would use the language of I'm doing a new work,
Gotcha.
or they'll use the language of I'm starting a ministry. And frankly, for a lot of Black folks, um, because the Black church has been such a hub for social and political life, there wasn't
Hmm.
necessarily a need to start new sort of church buildings. What would happen is that people would have this apostolic sense of call, a prophetic sense of call, evangelistic sense of call, and they would go out and
Hmm.
start nonprofits,
Ah. Yep.
right?
Yep. Hmm.
They would start different ministries in the neighborhood that we would now probably call missional community.
Right. Right.
But like this language was not like
Yeah.
germane to us. Um,
Yep.
so
That's good.
you do see it, and part of the reason why it's really critical to to pay attention to that movemental work is because it's not been in bed with the kind of alignment and idolatry with the principalities and powers that we have seen in the more
That's good.
dominant forms of church planting. Even as many good brothers like yourself, Dan, are seeking to dismantle that as well, right? I think we have to pay homage to the fact that part of what
Yes.
groups like V3 and others are learning in terms of
Mm-hmm.
learning to do movemental work is an inheritance from people of color and
Yep.
black, even if maybe that's something that folks haven't actually learned from textbooks, etc. So
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, Brandon, how language, just the term church planning can prevent me from affirming and acknowledging God's work of starting new, fresh kingdom communities
yeah,
because you're not using my language,
yeah,
right? And so,
exactly.
I mean, I remember the first time you and I started connecting years ago, and you sharing with me the movement of new communities starting through Hush Harbors and
Yeah,
other places, and I was blown away. And I mean, that's part of my ignorance, but really tying what you're doing now to a history of how people of color have been out of the empire, breaking new ground, starting new, fresh spaces for people to belong and to become. And so that's really helpful. Just kind of because we're in the 21st century now, and church planning certainly has been apprehended by white folks as you use the kind of the industry.
yeah,
And so I think you are breaking open new space for people of color to see themselves as empowered to start new churches. So that's really
yeah.
helpful.
And just
My
a
Go ahead.
little nuance there, just a little nuance there. I would even say that I'm
Yep.
breaking open new territory. I'm standing on the shoulders of people who have been doing it, and
Yep.
what I'm seeking to do is popularize it,
Yep.
and I don't mean that in a like shallow way. I mean
Right.
popularize
Right.
stuff in a movemental way, so that new generations of people
Yes.
can become familiar with what has been done,
Yep.
and so that they can sort of take up that mantle as well. So I just want to
That's
provide
really helpful. That's
clarification.
really helpful, Brandon.
Yeah.
Last question I have, and then we're going to open it up for others.
Okay.
So you use leaderful environment,
Yeah.
and you talked about hierarchy real quick.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to ask about the fivefold. I want to ask about apostle, prophet, shepherd, teacher, evangelist,
Mm-hmm.
and how that informs or kind of leaks into intercultural planting
Mm-hmm.
to create a leaderful environment.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think some of this is historically is again a sort of semantic
Yep.
language issue. But I think for moving forward, I see it as extremely relevant. I
Mm,
see it as something that we can absolutely reclaim. And actually, I think it gives us an invitation to look at the Bible with fresh eyes, because
mm-hmm,
again, if we look at the Bible as the domain of as the sort of property of a dominant form of Christianity and people that
mm-hmm.
have been sort of in the dominant class throughout history, then
Yep.
we've misunderstood the gospel. We've misunderstood the scriptures in its historical literal context. But if we begin to see these terms and these leadership styles, these leadership intelligences in the New
Mm-hmm.
Testament, in the context of communities that are oppressed, that
Yep.
opens up all sorts of possibilities for
Right.
practices and principles and ministries that otherwise have been closed off because they've
Okay.
been, frankly, sort of kind of cut off from their roots, right? They've been sort of
Yep.
they have been whitewashed in a sense, right? Or
Yep.
sort of gentrified, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that there's a lot of possibility. And this could, the truth is this could be any one of our pieces of conversation could be its own kind of webinar. But I
Sure.
think I'll just give one example of this.
Yeah.
Take apostle, for example. I was going to use prophetic because that's more familiar to the Black church context, and that's language that's
Mm-hmm.
familiar. But
Mm-hmm.
because of that, that's part of the reason why I don't want to use it, because it's more familiar. But let me
Okay.
take the apostolic role. I think in sort of evangelical and often white evangelical context, apostolic means sort of taking new territory,
Okay.
right? Is a sort of crude way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
But if apostolic is seen in the context of intercultural movemental planting, apostolic is paying attention to where the kingdom of God, right? Paying attention
Mm-hmm.
to where the beloved community is breaking forth in local
Mm-hmm.
neighborhoods
Oh,
around the work of justice and healing. So what that means is that I'm less looking for people to go save, for example,
right.
and
Yep.
I'm more looking for where people are standing up for justice, right? That aren't currently involved in our
Mm,
expression of church, and looking to join them.
right.
Or if those people aren't standing up, I see the need or I see the issue, and I'm finding ways to
Mm,
be present in the midst of that injustice in order
mm,
to build relationships and build leadership and potentially build a missional community in that space.
mm.
So that would be an example of how it
Yeah.
looks different,
Wow.
and the context is different, is what I'm trying to get at. I think it
Yeah.
absolutely, the language can be brought to life in intercultural movemental planting, and in fact can be seen in its fullness, in its more full, in its more fully in its biblical meaning,
Sure.
because of the context of um, yeah, the current sort of context of injustice and oppression that we faced in our country and our
Yes.
neighborhood. So
That's good.
yeah.
That's really, really good, Brandon. I'm learning a lot, just kind of even on this webinar, just kind of hearing you tease out some of these concepts. I do have one last question, and I know that
Sure.
we're supposed to open it up.
Okay.
So you have placed a special emphasis on place-based. I hear you keep talking about local presence and neighborhood.
Hmm.
Um, how how is that instrumental to the culture of to the to the ethos of an intercultural church plant?
Yeah.
Um, and I'm asking that because I've attended
Hmm.
um, stated multi-ethnic churches before,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, and in the neighborhood, the actual concrete, local, marked out place
Hmm.
hasn't been the hasn't been in the water.
Hmm.
It's more seeing if they can draw people to a great experience,
Hmm.
into a multi-ethnic experience, rather than presence moving outward in contending for injustice or
Hmm.
brokenness or healing in a
Hmm.
place. So how does neighborhood fit? Why is it essential? Why is it connected to
Yeah.
your concept of intercultural planting?
So I said a couple of things related to what you're saying about
Yep.
some of these multi-ethnic churches. I agree with you, and at the same time, I recognize that historically, at least in Black and Brown communities,
Yep.
church is not just a place where we gather; it's a place where we experience healing
Mm,
because when we go out, like
yep.
going out to the context of our neighborhoods and our communities, it's
Yes.
like going out into a war zone. So
Right.
so in that way, it's almost kind of like I know Stanley Hauerwas wasn't thinking about us when he was writing this, but it's almost with the way the sort of movement around the church being an alternative politic, right?
Oh, okay. Yep.
That big reason. I'm not saying this is true for all of those multi-ethnic churches. I'm saying
Sure. Yep.
I have witnessed this, that that there is no bifurcation between sort of mission that we do
Yep.
in our personal lives and in our families and our neighborhoods and what we do
Yes.
Sunday morning. The Sunday
Gotcha.
morning is self-missional for us because we're seeking the healing
Yep.
and refuge from the sort of the wasteland, if you will. But
Mm,
in terms of neighborhood for intercultural movemental planning, I think that's true what I just said. But also, I think that um, just looking at the current landscape around geography, right, and place, that
yes.
a lot of the places where we find where we could even come to imagine intercultural relationships, because typically it's much more difficult to be in a white context and invite Black and Brown people to be a part than it is to be in a Black and Brown context and invite
Right.
people to be a part. Now, what that has turned into in the context of real estate and development is this phenomenon across the country of ethnic displacement. Now, the fancy word we
Right.
use is gentrification, but really it's the displacement of ethnic minority people and poor people. And
Mm,
so neighborhood is absolutely essential to
mm,
intercultural movemental planting in the present moment. That actually part of the work that we have to be, I have a friend that was thinking about doing missional community, white guy, white brother, good brother. And he was talking about sort of dreaming about missional community, and he was dreaming about his mission before he even got there. I'm like, hold on, brother. Like, no, you discern your mission when you get amongst the people.
yes.
At the, even though I believe that, at the same time, we have eyes to see that a
Mm,
crucial phenomenon across our country is this issue of ethnic displacement. So neighborhood, if for nothing else, though it does involve more than this, at the very
yes.
least, it involves doing the work of helping keep people housed. That's a
Mm,
neighborhood ministry,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? that means having to be involved in the kinds of conversations and ministries that would contend against the principalities and powers that would seek to displace folks through policy, right, and through business development in our local
Yeah.
neighborhood. So
Yeah.
it's inherent to
That's
intercultural
great.
movement planting. Yeah.
Oh, that's so good, Brandon. Thanks, man. I'm done.
Wow. Very, very, very rich conversation, and we have lots of questions. So we'll just tackle as many as we can. Brandon, there's a question around what intercultural looks like in a middle upper class context. You know, in a community where 25% of the people are born outside of the country in a fairly middle to upper class community. What how do we handle that, and how do we have a intercultural lens for that, when most times when people think multicultural, they think inner city and
That's
poor?
right. That's right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's a lot, again, drawing from the tradition, right? We having eyes to see that this has been done before, and sort of remixing it for the present moment. And one way is to ask the question, what is the movement towards the kingdom for middle class neighborhoods, right? It may not necessarily be towards people of other ethnicities, because that may not be where the conflict is, but it's certainly around issues of class or issues of possession. So this is where the wisdom of traditions like the Catholic worker movement become really, really important. How do we invite people into downward mobility, right? How do we invite people into the work of learning to share resources, maybe not within their neighborhood, but there's always Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria to the ends. There's always something right outside. How did that land and that property come to be the way that it is, right? We're always tied to histories of land and place, and where we rest our bodies and right around there. So there's always a chance to engage people in intercultural movemental planting. It just may look different in terms of the scale, perhaps, or the zip code, perhaps, if that makes sense. And frankly, I think that I won't say it's more challenging, but I think it's probably less in vogue to do it in that That's probably where it's the most needed. You know, is to do it in the context of the suburbs and in middle and upper class neighborhoods. And so whoever asked that question, contact us, contact V3. That's the work of this revival that I'm talking about, this moral and prophetic urgency. Let's dream together and figure out how to do that on the ground. So
Yes, I love that. The question, how do we move towards the kingdom, like from wherever the starting point is? That's some awesome stuff. So what about multi-income? So kind of like a mixed income situation. Can you kind of speak to that, what that might look like?
yeah, definitely. Yeah. So and I alluded to some of that already, and that some of that is our present phenomenon around these gentrified neighborhoods, right? If you are doing intercultural movemental planting in an urban environment, you will have mixed income involved in it. But even beyond that, right? Like there are ways that the same kind of principles apply around reciprocity and around justice, right? Like if the way in which we're seeking to do mission, for example, locally, and it is to meet the needs of a particular population, right? We're not doing it in a way that's toxic charity. We're doing it in a way that is rooted in reciprocity, relationship, and seeking to address the injustice by supporting the leadership of those folks directly impacted by the injustice to bring solutions and to correct, to repair, or to bring repentance to that situation, not as the saviors in that. And so automatically you have people involved in that. But I would say if you're involved in urban church planting, in any context, that's just going to be a part of the way it works. Like here in my neighborhood, right? Like in some ways, I'm a part of the gentry, right? Even though I'm a Black man, I'm in a Black neighborhood, right? I'm in a Black underserved neighborhood. I'm literally sitting here right now in my home office, right? Like I'm a part. Like it's just part of the way that things are that things have shaped have transpired in the context of the urban landscape at this point.
Brandon, give me a couple like practical little bits of how you help people who are under-resourced financially, under it, actually participate. Because one time we were talking, you said that you were discovering that people that are under-resourced can't even attend some of your meetings because,
Absolutely. Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
how do
Good
you,
point. I
yeah,
would say a couple of things is childcare. Like
yeah,
here's just some practical things that we've used. You got to have childcare, right? Like the times that you set up meetings need to be appropriate for folks. So like oftentimes that looks like not necessarily doing stuff in the morning time on the weekends, because folks have been they're right. That's part of their struggle. Part of the class struggle is around being slaves to corporations, right? Being slaves to certain kinds of employer systems that are not treating their employees as humans. And so folks don't really have a strong sense of agency around their time. So finding the times that work for people, and the only way you can know that is through being in a relationship. And
Mhm.
then what that means is, for the folks who have more freedom around their time, that you got to sacrifice. Maybe it's not at the time that you're used to having those meetings. You need to do them at the time that the people who are most impacted can engage in that work. Or or you can just engage in mission the way that everyone does it, which is that we'll do it, and then we will have photo ops with the people who receive the goods that we provide, right? But if it's going to be justice oriented and intercultural, you meet people where they are. And things like childcare, things like the time that you have meetings is really, really crucial. And that's just a couple of examples.
I want to press into that. You mentioned relationship, and really we have questions that kind of come from both sides of the coin. So one question, as a white middle-aged planter, one of my questions is how and where can I connect with people different from me to build the diverse team that's needed to establish intentionally diverse, distinctively Christian community? So that's
Hmm.
one. The second side of that, or the other side, is here in Portland, Oregon, people of color generally have a lot of fatigue around connecting with white folks.
Right.
So, what has been helpful for you in terms of nurturing um, people of color and strengthening them so they have the energy to engage in transformative conversations with white folks? So, please
Yeah,
talk
that's a good
to
question.
both.
I would say that you can't force people to do that kind of stuff. Like there's gotta be patience. You find the willing, and the willing may be other white folks, for white folks that are trying to do it. Caucusing is a very, very important ministry, an important form of engaging in intercultural movemental planting. If you're not familiar with caucusing, you can look it up. But caucusing, getting together with other white folks to do the kind of healing that is necessary to pay attention to your own heritage, right?
Mm,
Because a lot of what happens is we're not individuals, right? We come from families, we come from institutions, we come from neighborhoods that have shaped the way we've come to engage people that are different than us. And so oftentimes it's actually not the most appropriate to have people of color in those contexts, because it's re-traumatizing for a lot of us to have to carry that emotional labor for someone when they really should do it with people that are in a similar situation. Again, the sort of to use a community organizing term, the iron rule, that you don't do for people what they can do for themselves, right?
mm,
Like, you get together with people that are impacted in the same way as you, and that brings an incredible amount of solidarity and healing to engage in that. Even though you can't stay isolated like that, it could turn into isolationism. But for a season and for a time, it's appropriate to do that kind of work. It's the same reason why, in predominantly white institutions, people of color have caucus spaces. You know, there'll be clubs for particular ethnic minority groups, for example, right? And so, again, the purpose of that is to get organized, and to get organized around the kinds of goals that would bring the kind of healing and liberation and wholeness that we're looking for, with people who have similar backgrounds to us, so that we can then go out and be better equipped to sort of not unintentionally put um, uh, sort of emotional labor on folks that they are not necessarily asking for or are aware that they're signing up for. So hopefully that's
mhm.
helpful.
That's good. You really said a lot. And I want to circle back with, I guess, follow up with the idea of contemplative spirituality. What
Yeah.
is the interrelation ship of that with intercultural church planting, and how might that be a resource
Yes.
as folks engage?
Yes. If you can't sing about the faith and the vision that we have for a more just and beautiful and diverse world, right, then, like, you gonna get real bored and dry and angry. Singing together with people is really, really important. So, like, singing is one of those practices. For example, sometimes we just need to shut up and be silent, right? And learn the practice of humming. These sorts of practices come from our ancestors, who were wise and didn't have degrees or the technical language to give analysis around this, but they just knew. They knew the kinds of rooted practices they need to sustain themselves for the long haul. And that's where contemplative spirituality comes in. People call it different things, and that's fine. But like, what are those spiritual practices that nurture the soul in community, and that by engaging in those practices those practices wouldn't themselves wouldn't be re-traumatizing or causing harm to the people in the community. So this is where it's not devoid of the mind and devoid of discernment, right? We still have to be careful about the kind of practices that we engage in, whether or not, like I'll give you an example of this. Like, we don't want to, let's say that we are in the context of in a neighborhood where there are native people that and we've come to learn about their spirituality. Like, you don't want to be engaging in native practices without the permission and the relation and without relationship with native people, right? Like, you want to do that like, otherwise what you do is often unintentionally causing harm. And when you're trying to do good and you're trying to like cultivate your soul, so yeah, you got to sing about this. We got to be able to be silent sometimes and just to experience each other's presence and to be able to hear the birds sing, right? To pay attention to nature and how it informs the ways in which God is always at work and on the move, even that we're not invincible. And so that's really, really critical. Contemplative spirituality is critical to this.
Mm-hmm. And then how should we account for the idea that this might look different depending on each person's starting point? Even the
Absolutely.
idea of contemplative spirituality. How do we lean in?
Yeah, it does for sure. I would encourage a lot of things with this in terms of a different starting point. This is where, when you start getting into the specific sort of niche that you have in your particular context, it's important to have several conversation partners that are to come in with a village, right? To be able to sort of give feedback on this and how to do this work. This is where the cohort could be really, really vital for you. It's also where you need to be listening to the voices of people who have done it, maybe in books that are out there, or to other planters that who have been on the ground doing this, or to just other pastors or missionaries in that community who've been around for a while. And again, like we shared at the beginning, Dan and I were talking about, don't get caught up in the sort of linguistic um, sort of gymnastics. Missionary and pastor can be the senior Black woman that's on the porch all the time out in the neighborhood and is providing ministry to young kids and everybody that walks by. Like, they are a missionary. They're the best missionary in that neighborhood, right? So I think those are some practical pieces there.
Great. I've got another question just around, and for those of you who are still with us, we have a couple more questions and definitely want to make a really important announcement before we wrap up. So you talked about racial differences. What does it look like to pursue intercultural planting in contexts where there's a language barrier? So not just nomenclature, but literal language, Spanish to English, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's critical. That's less. I have less of a background in that particularly, but I think the same kind of principles around relationship are really, really crucial. That the reciprocity you need is really, really critical. Finding someone from that community who is able to provide translation to partner with you in ministry, so that it's not you going to learn the language and then going in and trying to do it solo, right? As someone that's very different, and there's that power dynamic there, but doing it in partnership with someone who is native to that community, right? That can help do that, and that may take some time. But I think that those are the kind of sacrifices needed that God blesses, and that in the long run, it ends up being much more authentic and much more rooted than taking the sort of shortcut version of not doing it in a way that is just and that is in relationship and in partnership.
Great. Well, so this final question, I think I can probably provide a little bit of an answer to it as well. It was just how there's a desire to delve into the theology and the community of this topic, and so someone asked about how they can meet up and continue to pray through this and talk through it, network through it, and meet regularly. So with that, I would love Tanya, if you can share the slide once more. We want to let everybody know on the call that we have launched an intercultural church planting co-op. And I'll just share the description. So local neighborhoods across the world are becoming more globalized than ever. In the US by 2055, there will be no racial ethnic majority. In the US and globally, the wealth gap between rich and poor is getting greater and greater than ever, disproportionately along racial lines. So we, as a response to that, have constructed a 30-week cohort training experience provided by the V3 movement to really learn how to plant intercultural movemental church. So if you have been really intrigued by the subjects that Brandon has led us through, that's an opportunity to delve into that. And not just in an academic way, but as a practitioner, learning and doing. The subjects that would be covered within that cohort focus on missional foundations, intercultural competencies, faith-rooted social justice, community organizing, relational infrastructure, and much more. And so we want to make sure that everyone knows that that is an opportunity that you have. With that, Brandon, I'll give you one last question. In all of what we shared with intercultural planting, what is the role of evangelism in this movement? How do we integrate that? And with that, once you drop the mic, we're done.
Yeah, that's a loaded question to end it on. Let me say it this way. Do we believe that there is good news amidst the challenges that we face? Do we believe that all that we are limited to are winners and losers in the context of God's vision for the new creation? If we believe that there's something transformative happening, then we got to tell people about it. And there's a way to tell people about it, right? There's a way to tell people about it that also is consistent with the kinds of principles and practices that I've talked about in intercultural movemental planting, right? That shares the gospel in a way that is not toxic charity, that shares the gospel in a way that's rooted in relationship, that shares the gospel in a way that is holistic and concerned about the whole person, about their families, about their whole communities, about God's vision of beloved community and shalom and justice. And so there is a role. And frankly, as someone who in the fivefold, I'm an apostle and evangelist. Listen, you talking to the right person about evangelism. I'm always trying to get people recruited and signed up to be involved in God's kingdom work. So it's really, really crucial. So thanks for asking that question.
Thanks. Well, we want to thank everybody for joining in today's webinar. Stay tuned for the next one. We're glad that you joined us today, and we hope that you will join us in this journey of intercultural planting. Take care.